In this video, you will examine specific individuals who fought for the abolition of slavery and 5 ways slaves could become free. So open to your notes section, take good notes, and as usual, see me with any questions or if you need clarification on anything. Paths to freedom. It may surprise you to know that there were many free blacks living in Maryland during the time of slavery. In 1790, only 7% of all blacks in Maryland were free, but in 1860 that number had increased to 49%. Delaware was the only slave state that had a higher number of free blacks. Within the city of Baltimore, the percentage of free blacks was even higher. It reached 90% in 1860. In fact, Baltimore had the largest concentration of free blacks of any city in the country at this time. There were several ways in which the free blacks of Maryland may have gained their freedom. Some blacks, for instance, were free because they had been born free. Two well-known examples were Marylanders Benjamin Banneker and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Yet even blacks who were born into freedom risked the danger of being kidnapped and sold into slavery elsewhere. Free blacks were required to carry freedom papers, a legal document that proved they were free, with them at all times. Nevertheless, kidnappers frequently ignored those papers in favor of the money they could make by selling a person into slavery. The upheaval caused by the Revolutionary War provided opportunities for other slaves to gain freedom. Many slaves took advantage of the circumstances and escaped during the fighting and disorder created by the war. Because they had been promised freedom, some slaves worked for the British and against American patriots. For example, in 1775, Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, promised freedom to those slaves who were willing to fight for England. About 800 joined him, and Dunmore used them to raid the coast of Virginia. Slaves could also become free by purchasing their freedom or by having their freedom purchased by others. Because some enslaved blacks had been trained as artisans or were skilled in the boating trades, they were able to earn money for their services. Employment ranged from bakers and printers to stable keepers. Some hired themselves out to others, some created handicrafts to sell, and others worked in their gardens and sold surplus produce. All of these slaves used the cash they received in order to buy their freedom or the freedom of a family member or a friend. Yet any arrangement to purchase freedom could be ruined by a slave owner who refused to honor the agreement or who would increase the price at the last moment. Sometimes a slave owner might sell a slave who was about to purchase his or her freedom. Nevertheless, although this decision could create tough economic conditions for slave families, the idea of freedom far outweighed any desire to buy property, food, and clothing, or even to pass money down to the next generation. Enslaved blacks might gain their freedom by manumission. In most colonies, this process that had been strictly legislated. In Virginia, for example, an enslaved African could not be set free except for some meritorious service to be adjudged and allowed by the governor and council. Many owners manumitted their slaves as part of their wills. In some states, however, legally free slaves could be re-enslaved in order to pay the debts of their former owners. Finally, some enslaved blacks decided to leave familiar surroundings, family, and friends, and run away from their owners. Slaves had a better chance to escape to freedom in the Chesapeake region because they could follow the many creeks and inlets of the tidewater areas. Fugitive slaves were also helped by the Underground Railroad, a secret network of people who provided escaped slaves with shelters and provisions so that they may reach the North or Canada safely. Fugitive slave laws were enacted in order to help return runaways to their owners, and they set fines upon those who would harbor or help fugitive slaves gain freedom. As a result, runaways were hunted like animals and escapes were treacherous. Those who were captured suffered cruel punishments such as whipping, branding, or crippling. Others were sold far away. So there you have the five main ways that a slave could become free. Now, I know some of the words, some of the vocabulary in those readings might be a little difficult, and it may be difficult to even understand the method that a slave might attain their freedom. And this is one of those times that if you're not sure about one or some of them, that you need to see me for clarification, and I will be happy to clarify any of those methods for you. Certain people, both white and black, fought very hard for what they believed in, oftentimes putting their own lives at risk. Today, we will be looking at some of those brave individuals. Abolitionist. Now, here's a definition you're definitely going to want to know. An abolitionist was someone, white or black, who takes action to stop slavery. Pretty simple definition, but pretty clear also. An abolitionist. Make sure you can pronounce that. Can you say it right now? Good. Abolitionist. This is a very famous book. It was written in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. You may have heard of it before. It was written by a very famous author by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this was a story of a slave and what the slaves had to endure during this time period. And when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this, many people that lived in the North did not know the terrible conditions under slavery in the South. They just had not heard about it. There were no TVs, there was no radio, no internet, so many Northerners didn't know what was going on in the South. When she wrote this novel, again, which is a fictitious story, it's not about anyone that actually lived, it's a fictitious slave. When she wrote this, many people in the North bought the book and read it, and they were shocked and appalled by it, just like how you may have been shocked and appalled at some of the sources you examined last week. And when the Northerners read this, it really introduced them to the terrible conditions endured by slaves in the South. So this really kind of woke up the North and kind of gave them a good shake and said, hey, this is going on. We need to do something about it. I'd like you to pause the video at this point and read this short summary on Uncle Tom's Cabin so you can gain this information. Jot down what you think are the most important facts. And when you are done reading, hit play and resume the video. Okay, right around this time, the Republican Party was formed. Now, the Republican Party originally was formed in the 1850s to stop the spread of slavery in the West. That's important. We have our opinions of the Republican Party and the Democrats and the different political parties in Congress and in American society, but originally the Republican Party was formed to stop the spread of slavery in the West, and Abraham Lincoln was one of the very first Republicans, certainly the first early famous Republican, and we'll get more on him later. Now I'm going to go through a list of abolitionists, starting with the most famous one, Harriet Tubman. You've probably heard of her before. And you're going to need to write down their names, and you're going to need to write down the very short kind of statement about them. And I will tell you that when I quiz you, I am not going to ask you to fill in the blanks on this part, and I'm not going to ask you to write the sentence about the abolitionist, but what I will do is give you the name of the abolitionist and the statements, and you will have to match them. You'll have to match the correct statement with the correct abolitionist. So that's how it will be on your weekly assessment. Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave, the most famous and daring conductor of the Underground Railroad. Now this is a map showing the Underground Railroad. Very important to know that the Underground Railroad was not underground, and it wasn't a railroad. It's called underground because it was secret. Sometimes they say things are underground because they're secret. And railroad just implied a path or a track to travel. And these are some of the paths on the Underground Railroad. And they were just kind of ways that slaves could go along to escape to the north or up to Canada or down south across the ocean to the West Indies and these islands. And all along the way, there were people that would tell escaping slaves they could hide in their homes, and there were people that led them on their way. They were called conductors on the Underground Railroad, and Harriet Tubman was the most famous. Here's another map showing some of the Underground Railroad routes. Again, not railroads, not underground, but that was just the term for these different paths, the different routes that slaves could take to try to get free. So while Harriet Tubman was the most famous of the abolitionists, there were other ones that were very important. Denmark Vesey was born a slave. He later bought his freedom. Eventually, he was betrayed and executed for abolitionist actions. Nat Turner led a slave revolt that killed over 50 whites and sparked harsher treatment of slaves, and was eventually caught and executed. Frederick Douglass, you may have heard of him, very famous. He was born a slave, escaped, then bought his own freedom. And he was very vocal, spoke out against slavery in the North, and eventually started a newspaper to spread abolitionist ideas. William Lloyd Garrison, a white male, an abolitionist leader who started an abolitionist newspaper, a very famous abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. The Grimke sisters, white sisters originally from South Carolina, wrote and spoke about the abolition of slavery. They had a very difficult time because they were white abolitionists speaking out against slavery in the South. And anyone who spoke out against slavery in the South had a pretty tough time of it. Sojourner Truth, a freed slave, she spoke out against slavery, becoming a leading abolitionist. That concludes this video on ways that slaves could become free and the abolitionists. Next, things will begin to heat up, and you can see by this animated map that the South is going to join together and secede from the nation. They're going to form their own country. And then as the map progresses, it takes us all the way through the Civil War. Again, any questions, any concerns, any clarification, please see me as soon as possible.